to scary stories. I suppose I'm glad Amy took her laptop to the campsite. Well, not glad, obviously. It's hard to be glad of anything when I know my life can now be measured in minutes, but thanks to her need to be connected to everything all the time, I can tell our story in the time I have left. I'm currently lying on my back in a hotel room which I am struggling to accept will be my tomb. The bed is comfortable, the lights are bright, the TV on the wall is huge. It all seems so friendly and welcoming. My heart is fluttering like I've been running, but it's just fear. Adrenaline. It's like my heart's trying to act as alive as it possibly can, to squeeze a lifetime of beating into these last frenzied moments. It's finding this as difficult to accept as I am, the fact that I will die here before the dawn slips over the horizon, when there's really no reason why we couldn't have carried on for another 60 or 70 years. But there is a reason, and it's a reason I need to tell you about, whilst I try not to listen to the desperate thumping in my chest, each rhythmic beat counting down to a grand finale I've come to almost accept is now inevitable. Almost. The occasional stab of hysterical fear still grips me, but there's nothing I can do. Not against them. They call them the quiet ones, or at least that's what the old man told me. It's the name the old folks gave to the shapes in the dark, the things that crouch in the shadow just beyond the edge of sight. They are the ones that creep unseen through the underbrush at night and dance beneath the moon away from the eyes of humans. And so they would have remained, living alongside us in their dark, hidden world, if we had not broken the ancient laws, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a sunny morning as we drove up. I can hardly believe this was only 2 days ago. My friends were still alive then. I mustn't think about how many times we could have turned back, how many words I could have used to change the plan. I knew there was something wrong with that place. Of course, there were no signs, no warnings of any physical kind to prevent us driving off the road 3 miles before the campsite and crashing off through the undergrowth. I almost feel that we were being drawn there, and perhaps we were. In fact, I'm sure we were. The car was being scraped and brushed mercilessly by the overhanging trees, and more than once I asked Amy if she was sure this was even a trail, let alone a road. She insisted she'd seen a sign of some kind along the road, though she couldn't describe it. It was like a mixture of confusion and pride alone was keeping her foot pressed on the accelerator. We bumped and jolted along, the 2 boys grinning widely in the back, until at last the mud track opened up into a clearing. The grassy area was maybe 50 feet across, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. Old trees stretched up around us, their old and gnarled branches reaching like twisted fingers into the darkening sky. As I got out of the car, I realized how deathly quiet it was. I could hear nothing of the road we'd left behind, though it couldn't be more than a mile or 2 behind us, and no birds fluttered above. It was like the world was holding its breath, or perhaps that the world itself was just different here. I wanted to leave more or less the moment I stepped out of that car and looked up at those horrible trees. I'd looked up the campsite we were actually aiming for, and it had showers, a clubhouse, a coffee and bacon sandwich van in the mornings. This was a clearing in a forest, and I did not want to be there. The boys, of course, loved it. We'd barely stopped before they started pulling the bags out and setting up the camp, almost falling over themselves to be the first to get their tent up. Amy and I watched them with that resigned, world-weary expression female friends of overgrown man-children tend to adopt when they get together and act, well, like overgrown man-children. I remember watching them yelling and shoving one another, enjoying themselves, and not quite being able to shake that horrible sense of foreboding. But nothing I said was taken seriously, and eventually I gave up, resigned to the fact that we were spending the weekend in that dark, quiet place literally in the middle of nowhere. That night was when it started. We had a fire going, and Tom had his feet too close to it. He didn't think anything of it. The night was cold and we were all trying to get as close to the flames as possible. But when he stood up to get a beer, he realized his left hiking boot had almost fallen apart. The heat had melted whatever rubbery glue held it together, and the sole was no longer attached. After a lot of laughter, swearing and general hilarity, he threw the ruined boot off into the darkness. We didn't know it at the time, but that was what had sealed our fate. The next morning Tom was gone. We weren't worried at first, thinking he'd just gotten up early and wandered off, but then Simon noticed the boot. Melted and ruined. The one Tom had thrown into the darkness. It was sitting, innocently enough, in the tent on his sleeping bag. But there was no sign of Tom. We all assumed as the morning wore on that Tom had walked into town to buy a new pair of boots. But when he didn't return by mid-afternoon, what had been a tense atmosphere soon became one of fear. Of course, there was no cell phone reception in that cursed clearing, so we were left with no choice but to search the woods and shout for him. We found nothing. No tracks, no Tom. As the light faded, we tried searching with flashlights, but when Amy wandered away and fell into thick stinking mud, losing her flashlight in the process, we abandoned the search. Amy was near hysterical by this point, and I wasn't far off myself. It was only because I had Simon with me that I was able to cope, and together we took Amy back and got her into our tent. The next morning, we decided we'd leave in the car and ask around the town, nearly 3 miles away. Surely that was the only place Tom could have gone. When I woke the next day, Amy was gone. Just gone. On her sleeping bag, as if it had every right to be there, was her flashlight. The one she'd lost in the forest. It was caked in mud, as though it had been pulled from the quagmire by someone and returned to her. I was terrified by this point, but Simon insisted that she must have resumed the search for Tom as soon as the sun rose, and had no doubt walked into town after finding nothing in the woods. She'd known that was our plan anyway, so it made some, though not perfect, sense. We were desperate at this point, on the verge of panic, so I suppose it's understandable that we weren't thinking straight. We took Amy's keys and left for the town. Simon's face was stony and grim the whole way there. We barely said a word. No one in town would speak to us about our friends. The villagers simply stared at us, made suggestions about other campsites, acted like they knew nothing. But in their eyes I could see something more. An understanding. A fear. Like they knew perfectly well what was happening but wouldn't say. Simon said I was being paranoid, and had to drag me out of the police station by force when I lost my self-control and started screaming at the officer behind the desk. He'd barely even blinked, just given me a bland assurance that they'd look into it, without even a hint that he meant it. The sun was setting by the time we walked with resignation into the little shop by the edge of the village. An old man, careworn and ragged, was about to close up when we arrived. As we silently grabbed sandwiches neither of us wanted, he asked if we were the ones he'd heard were asking about their missing friends. By then I'd given up hope, so those words were like a fire inside me and I almost threw myself over the counter. He smiled sadly, told us there was no chance of finding our friends. He explained to me what I now know, what I didn't believe at the time. The quiet ones have always stalked us, flitting between the shadows and murky unseen depths just beyond our world. Sometimes, in ancient forgotten places, their world and ours overlap. Out in the dark, untouched wilds, the forests and the mountains, some places remain where the barrier between them and us wears perilously thin. If we keep to our side, they must keep to theirs. But for the unwary fool who strays one dark night too far, beyond the wispy veil of our territory and into the quiet, only horror awaits. Because the age-old pacts, struck millennia ago by our terrified ancestors, still hold even now. Those who violate their world belong to them, just as it has always been. Tom's shoe, Amy's torch. Both carelessly thrown into the darkness, both returned in place of their owners. A terrible balance restored, a terrible bargain fulfilled. Simon flew into a rage before the old man finished speaking, shouting and threatening like a lunatic. He knocked a stack of papers off the counter as he lunged for the old man, but just then the police officer from the station arrived and curtly demanded that we leave. I expected Simon to drive us away, to leave the hideous place far behind. But he was incensed, in an impotent fury that stole his reason. I pleaded with him to drive on, but he was just as angry with me for believing the old man's lies. To prove a point, he drove us back to the clearing, and leaping from the car ran into the woods, screaming and daring whatever demons lurked there to show themselves. I was too terrified not to follow, tears streaming down my face, my cries rebounding from the half-seen boughs of ancient trees. Simon was far ahead of me, his hysterical screams echoing into the woods, before they rose in a final horrified shriek and were abruptly cut off. I turned to run and fell in a blind panic. I flailed and thrashed, imagining spiny hands clutching at me, dragging me towards a gloomy otherworld from which I'd never escape. But I got up, and I ran. Somehow I made it back to the clearing, slammed the car into gear and drove away, still crying, heading back to civilization without looking back. Shortly after that I arrived here. A cheap hotel by the roadside. Warm and inviting. Thinking I was safe. But then I realized my watch was missing. My left arm was caked in mud, with scratches from where I'd fallen amongst the brambles and roots. I must have left it there. Or somewhere between there and here. The same place the boot had been thrown. The same place the flashlight had been lost. The place where Simon had crossed over and not returned. So they'll be coming for me. I don't have long. Just enough to warn you. Remember me, and beware the quiet ones. The taxi driver. It was a cold, moonlit night when Sarah hailed a taxi after a late-night shift at the office. She was exhausted and just wanted to get home and crawl into bed. The taxi pulled up, its windows tinted so dark that she couldn't see the driver inside. Ignoring her unease, she got in and gave her address to the driver. As the taxi started moving, Sarah noticed something odd. There was no sound coming from the radio, and the driver remained completely silent. She tried to strike up a conversation, but her words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. Unease turned into anxiety as the taxi driver began taking strange, unfamiliar routes. The roads grew narrower, winding through dimly lit streets with dilapidated houses that seemed frozen in time. Sarah's heart raced, her mind filled with questions. Why wasn't the driver responding? Where was he taking her? Suddenly, the taxi screeched to a halt in front of an old, abandoned building. The driver turned around, his face obscured by the shadows cast by the dim streetlights. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the driver's eyes were completely devoid of life, like twin pools of darkness. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah tried to open the door, but it was locked. Panic surged through her veins as she frantically searched for a way out. In a desperate bid for escape, she smashed the window with her elbow, cutting herself in the process. Blood trickled down her arm as she climbed out of the broken window and sprinted away from the taxi. As she ran, the air grew colder, and Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty streets. Glancing back, she saw the taxi slowly following her, its headlights illuminating the desolate surroundings. The driver's face remained hidden, but his eyes never wavered from her. Fear propelled Sarah forward, each breath ragged and desperate. She stumbled upon a narrow alley, hoping to find refuge. But as she turned the corner, she realized it was a dead end. Trapped, she closed her eyes, preparing for the worst. But just as she braced herself, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Opening her eyes, Sarah saw a police car skidding to a stop, officers rushing out with their guns drawn. The taxi driver tried to escape, but the officers apprehended him, his eyes still devoid of life. They explained that he was a serial kidnapper, known for luring unsuspecting victims into his taxi. He had managed to avoid capture for years, leaving a trail of fear and disappearances in his wake. Trembling and bloodied, Sarah thanked the officers, her heart still pounding in her chest. She realized how close she had come to becoming another victim. From that day forward, she vowed never to ignore her instincts, especially when it came to trusting strangers in the dead of night. And so, Sarah's harrowing encounter with the horror taxi driver remained etched in her memory, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of the seemingly ordinary world. Months passed since Sarah's encounter with the horror taxi driver, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. She had moved on from the terrifying incident, but its impact lingered, leaving her with a newfound vigilance and a constant unease whenever she stepped into a taxi. One evening, as rain poured heavily outside, Sarah found herself once again needing a ride home after a long day at work. She hesitated before flagging down a taxi, memories of her previous ordeal resurfacing. Pushing her fears aside, she reminded herself that not all taxi drivers were monsters. Reluctantly, she climbed into the back seat of the next available taxi. The raindrops drummed against the roof, creating an eerie symphony that heightened her anxiety. The driver, an older man with a grizzled beard, turned to greet her with a warm smile. Feeling a slight sense of relief, Sarah settled into her seat. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, the driver struck up a conversation, his voice soothing and gentle. They talked about mundane things, the weather, and their favorite movies, slowly easing the tension that had gripped Sarah. Yet, even with the friendly conversation, Sarah couldn't shake off the remnants of her past trauma. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the road behind them, and that's when she noticed it, a flickering shadow that seemed to be following them just at the edge of her vision. Her heart skipped a beat as she pointed it out to the driver. He glanced at the mirror, his expression turning serious. Without saying a word, he accelerated, swerving through the rain-soaked streets, trying to lose whatever was pursuing them. Sarah's pulse quickened as the shadowy figure drew closer, its form distorted and elusive. The taxi driver's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, determination etched on his face. He navigated through the labyrinthine city, ducking into narrow alleyways and taking abrupt turns, trying to outmaneuver their pursuer. But the shadowy figure was relentless. It seemed to defy the laws of nature, appearing at impossible angles and corners, closing in on them with every passing moment. Sarah's fear returned in full force, mingled with a spark of hopelessness. Just when they thought they couldn't escape, the taxi driver made a sudden turn into an underground parking garage. He killed the engine, plunging them into darkness, except for the faint glow of the emergency lights. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for the figure to appear. Minutes passed like an eternity. The garage remained eerily silent, devoid of any signs of their pursuer. Slowly, Sarah exhaled, a mix of relief and confusion washing over her. Had they managed to shake it off? The driver turned to her, a smile of triumph playing on his lips. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice filled with a hard-earned victory. "We made it." Sarah stared at the taxi driver, her heart still racing from the adrenaline rush of their escape. She couldn't help but feel grateful for his quick thinking and determination. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. The driver nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "No need to thank me, miss. It was my duty to keep you safe." He glanced at the rearview mirror once more, just to be sure they were truly alone. Satisfied that the danger had passed, he let out a long sigh. As the tension began to ease, Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. "What was that thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen anything like it." The driver's expression grew somber, and he hesitated before answering. "I wish I had a definite answer for you, miss," he said. "But it's something I've encountered before. A creature that preys on unsuspecting souls, lurking in the shadows of the city." Sarah shivered at the thought. "How did you know how to get away from it?" she asked, her voice filled with awe and admiration. The taxi driver smiled, his eyes distant with memories. "I've had my fair share of encounters with these creatures over the years," he explained. "You see, I'm not just an ordinary taxi driver. I'm part of a secret society, tasked with protecting innocent people from supernatural threats that go unnoticed by the rest of the world." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise. She had always dismissed stories of the supernatural as mere fiction, but her recent experiences made her question everything she thought she knew. "So, you're like a supernatural guardian?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. The driver chuckled softly. "Something like that," he replied. "We operate in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of ordinary people. It's our duty to ensure that these creatures don't harm innocent souls." Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder. She had stumbled upon a hidden world she had never known existed. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. The driver's expression grew serious once again. "You have a choice," he said. "You can go back to your ordinary life, knowing that you've encountered something beyond explanation. Or you can join us, become part of the fight against these supernatural threats." Sarah's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts and emotions. The terror she had experienced was still fresh in her memory, but so was the exhilaration of surviving and the desire to protect others from similar horrors. She looked at the driver, determination shining in her eyes. "I want to join you," she said firmly. "I want to help others and make sure no one else goes through what I've been through." The driver nodded approvingly. "Welcome to the Society of Shadows, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and reassurance. "Together, we will stand against the darkness and protect those who cannot protect themselves." And with that, Sarah embarked on a new chapter of her life, stepping into a hidden world filled with danger, mystery, and the promise of making a difference. The taxi driver ignited the engine once more, and as they drove into the night, Sarah's unease transformed into a newfound sense of purpose. Little did she know that her journey had only just begun, and the secrets and challenges that awaited her would push her to her limits and redefine her understanding of the world. But armed with courage, determination, and the support of her newfound allies, Sarah was ready to face whatever darkness lurked ahead.